And welcome to the first short lecture from Chapter 7 in your textbook. So in this chapter we talk about power some more, right? We talked about power a lot in the first chapter in our introduction, and at the end we'll talk a little bit as well about resistance and how people react in the face of this kind of power. So as we discussed early in the first chapter, we have to recognize that power in and of itself is sort of the pervasive feature in organizational life. And so as a result, if we look at how organizational power operates, how it functions, then we begin to gain an understanding of what your book calls organizations as political sites. Now, when they say political sites, they're not talking about Republican or Democrat. Rather, they're simply political to the extent that there are different people with competing interests, right, with different goals. And there are, of course, also limited resources that need to go around. And so an examination of power shows us who achieves these goals, who benefits from the resources, and why, right, and in what ways. And so, again, for a critical examination of organizational communication, the study of flows of power is really key to our understanding. All right, so to begin, we'll talk a little bit about some perspectives on power, and we'll begin with the idea of power as social influence. So this theory of power arises out of the work of two academics named French and Raven, who argued that power's influence occurs when a psychological change takes place in a person, and they developed 5 bases for social power. So ways of understanding power and how it affects these psychological changes. So the first one is positional power. And as your book tells you, this occurs by virtue of someone's position in an organizational hierarchy. So we listen to the president of the university because he's the president, and in that position, he is granted power, right? It's the power is vested in the position itself. And so when you assume that position, you hold the power, right? This is positional power. Now, referent power, on the other hand, is based in the charisma of the person that's exercising influence. So if we look at some figures from history, so Steve Jobs comes to mind, right? A very charismatic business leader, right? Who much of whose power originally was referent power, right? His power when he was poor and just starting out didn't come from the billions of dollars he eventually earned. Rather, it came from his personality, from his charisma. The same can be said of someone like Charles Manson, who's able to lead a cult-like group of followers to commit murder for him, right? And their devotion to him comes out of his charisma, right? So those are both examples of referent power. Now, there's also expert power, and this power is found in a person's ability to provide an organization knowledge that other members cannot. So, in other words, you know how to do something other people don't do, and this gives you expert power. So, in the context of a college, for example, an English professor or an algebra professor, a mathematics professor, much of their power stems from their expert knowledge, the fact that they're able to teach students things that other people aren't. Computer programmers, another example of expert power. Dietitians, another example of expert power, right? These are people with specialized knowledge who are able to perform tasks for an organization that other people just can't because they don't have that kind of knowledge. Now, a very common, or much more common, kind of power that we see is what's called reward power. And if you have reward power, that just means that you're able to give people who work for you rewards, right? You're able to give them resources like money or days off or food, what have you, right? That can make them feel good about themselves and feel good about the organization. So again, I give you some examples here: promotions, pay raises. These are things that make people feel good about themselves and good about their organization. And then finally, another very common form of power is coercive power. And this is where we coerce people through the threat of negative consequences. So this is why should I make all these hamburgers? Well, if you don't, you're going to get fired. That's coercive power. Now, it's important to recognize that these kinds of powers often overlap. So the same person that tells you, I'm going to fire you if you don't get this report on my desk by 5 o'clock tomorrow, might be the same person who gives you a promotion when you consistently turn in those reports on time. So they can use both coercive and reward power. Likewise, the manager probably has power just by virtue of their position, right? They're not a worker, they're a manager. And so you see, these things are not isolated. They're not discrete forms of power. These are types of power, excuse me, that oftentimes overlap. Okay. It's also important to realize that the power in and of itself is not a thing. Power is a dynamic process, right? So there's this should be interdependence. So it's exercised through a dynamic process in which relations of interdependence exist between actors in organizational settings. So what that means is that power isn't a thing by itself. Power only exists when it's exerted over someone or something, right? So if you're stranded on a desert island, arguably you have no power because there's no one to exert it over, right? It's a state that only exists in interdependent relationships where people depend on one another and interact with one another. All right, so there are a number of debates that arise about the nature of power that come out of the study of political science in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And it was during this time, particularly in the 60s, right? It sort of caught on in the late 50s, really blossoms during the 70s, or 60s rather, and then slowly dies out in the 70s. And so political science during this period of time really wants to understand who holds power, how do they exercise it, why do they have it, how does it work? Right? These are the questions that people were asking. And this shouldn't be surprising, of course, because the 1960s were a unique time in American history because it was during the time when the children of the baby boom were teenagers or young people, and there were more of them than there were people my age. So for the first time in American history, there were more young people than there were older people. And it's natural, of course, I think, for younger people to question authority and power and see how it works, particularly in light of the social events that were occurring, cultural events that were occurring in the United States at the time. So there were a lot of things, events taking place that made people question the nature of authority, the legitimacy of authority. So the Vietnam War, for example, was wildly unpopular in the United States amongst younger people because in part of the draft, which still existed at the time. So young people were being forced to fight in a war that they didn't believe in. So that caused a lot of problems. There were many challenges to the racial inequities that existed in the United States during this period of time. The late 1950s, early 1960s were the heyday of the civil rights movement in the United States. There was a large feminist movement that was making great strides for equal rights for women as well. So obviously, again, during this time, people were really interested in power. And so out of political science during this time, there emerged two camps, the pluralists and the elitists. And together they formed the basis for what we call the community power debate in political science. So really, it was about who in a culture or a community, a society, holds power. How is it distributed? How is it spread out? Right, and who really has influence in this scenario? And so the pluralists said that power was evenly distributed throughout a society, and that no one group had undue influence over the decision-making process. Now, this might sound kind of strange, right? Until we begin to realize that the exercise of power is, in and of itself, a transactional event. It takes two people, at least, for someone to exercise power. And in order to exercise power, right, the other person has to be willing to put up with it and deal with it, right? This goes back to the idea that we talked about in our first in-person meeting, where I told you, you can't be a leader unless people want to be led. And so if someone exercises power over you, the language is unfortunate in that statement, right? Because it's not so much that they're exerting power over you, it's that you're agreeing to their power, right? You're granting them the power. And so that's sort of where the pluralists are coming from. Now, the elitists claim that power was concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, and this is arguably a more simplistic way of looking at power, and maybe the way most of us think about power in our day-to-day lives, because we don't consider the idea that we have to agree to give others power over us. It's natural, of course, to think in the elitist sense, because as a child, you're raised and you have parents, grandparents, your family, people in your lives, older people, who control your life, right? Tell you what time to go to bed, tell you when to take a bath, tell you what to eat for dinner, right? All these things. And so it's natural for us to look at power as something that's held by a privileged few and not recognize our role in the equation. All right, well, that's it for the first short lecture. Next time we'll talk about the 1, 2, and 3 dimensional models of power. Thanks for checking out my video.